All right, time to revisit the appending exercise that we went through in the last lecture. Now, if you recall, we had a 1997 file, we loaded up a 1998 file, and then appended the 97 data to create this kind of stacked version called transactions 1997, 1998. And that worked just fine. The only catch was that it left this component table, this 1997 table, on its own, and since it's dependent on it, we can't delete that one. So not a problem at all. You could move on and work with the data in its current form with no issue. But if you want to know an interesting way to kind of get around this, I'm going to show you how to point to a folder containing these files instead. So the first thing we're going to do is actually right click and delete these two transactions table. Don't worry, it's not goodbye for good. We'll be getting those back in an even more efficient way. So got rid of both of the transaction files. You should just have your lookups left here. And now what we're going to do first is actually navigate to the folder that contains all of our project files. So mine's right here on my desktop. And what you're going to do is add a new folder here. And let's call that folder transactions, and select and shift click to grab both of the transactions files, 97, 98, and drag those into that one folder containing transactions. And what that's going to allow us to do is point Power Query to this folder as opposed to the individual files within it. So I can close that window. Back here in my FoodMart data model, I'm going to go into New Query, From File, and down here at the bottom is my From Folder option. The only thing different is that there's this one step before the preview, which says, all right, well, we're pointing to a folder. Where is it? What's the path? So we can browse to the path, and it's in my FoodMart data. Only folder in that FoodMart data folder is transactions. So I'll select the transactions folder that I just created and press OK. And it populates the path. Press OK. And there you go. The preview looks a little bit different. Doesn't show me all of the records from each. Instead, it shows me that the folder I'm connecting to contains two files, FoodMart Transactions 1997.csv and FoodMart Transactions 1998.csv. And some info about those: one is modified, created, attributes, etc. So from here, you can use combine tools right off the bat without ever going into the editor. And as always, you can load right here without going into the editor. I'm not prepared to do that. I always like to go into the editor just to spot check, QA, make sure I'm customizing exactly how I want to deal with this data. So when we land in the query editor, things look a little bit unfamiliar here. We've got a table name based on the folder name, transactions, which is just fine. But the actual preview is showing something interesting. It's got this new column called content with binary. That's kind of confusing. It's got the names of my files, and then the columns are actually just informational columns about these files. They've got this expandable column called attributes. We've got the path. It really doesn't feel like what we need at all, but trust me, with a few clicks of the button, we'll get there. So first things first, I'm going to expand this queries pane because some interesting things are going to happen here as we append or stack the data together from the files in this folder. And the way I'm going to do that is looking at this content header in the first column. You've got this double down arrow button, and that's the combine files button. But all we're going to do is click that, and when we do that, it runs all sorts of these scripts to combine and stack these files on top of each other. So it shows an example now of what my data in the individual files looks like, and that looks good. I can say, okay, show me what the 97 file looks like. There we go. We've got transaction date, stock date, product ID, customer, store, and quantity. Let's confirm that 98 follows the same column structure and data types: transaction date, stock date, product, customer, store, and quantity. So that checks out. It's the same 6 columns, the same data types here. So we're good to go. So I'm going to press OK. And what's happening now is that it's actually running all of this stuff in the background that's making that append happen. And you can see here that there's this new query that showed up, a new whole folder of queries that says transform file from transactions. Now, depending on which version of Excel and which version of Power Query you're working with, this may look very different. You may not even have this folder. The thing is, we're never going to actually use these individual pieces, at least in the context of this course. So what I like to do is just minimize that folder there. And then if we click on the transactions query, it gets us back to kind of where we want to be. So now what we'll see is that we've got all of our data here, those same 6 familiar columns. If I sort by date, looks like ascending starts on January 1st, 1997, which makes sense. And if I sort descending, it ends on December 30th, 1998. So let's go ascending again. That's good news. It means I've got both full years of data here in my single appended file. And the only other difference is that it added this new column automatically, which is actually kind of helpful sometimes. It's called source.name, and that just shows you, press load more, that just shows you where the actual files are coming from. So in this case, it just appends the name of the file to each row. So in cases where you need to know, all right, this row of data, which file from the folder did it come from? This source name is really helpful for that. In this case, it's a really simple scenario, and we know that any 1997 date comes from the 97 file, and any 1998 date comes from the 98 file. So we don't actually need that source name. You can just delete that column. So at this point, we are in great shape. This is a nice, clean appended file. And remember, we deleted our original 97 and our original appended 97 through 98 files. So this is now our only transaction data that's going to be feeding into the data model. So we won't have any of those duplicate files that we were dealing with the first time we ran the append. So let's go ahead and close and load this to connection, data model, and load. You can see here in my workbook queries pane, we've got that same folder containing the intermediate transform steps. To be quite honest, I don't really know exactly why these are all created or how to disable them. So what I generally do is just hide that folder. And in this other queries bucket, these are the 5 that we now care about. So remember how when we appended the last time, we ended up with that 97 through 98 file with about 270,000 rows? Here we are with that same data table, but without any extras. So check the data model, transactions, there you go. So all of our dates as expected, 97 through 98. Close that out. Now, an interesting thing to note about this is that it's not always going to make sense to go through this kind of process of appending or merging data sets. And in fact, it tends to make more sense when you're working with flat files like CSVs that you need to stack and combine. Always think about what your source data looks like. So if you're connecting to a database, for instance, like a table in SQL, in many cases, any joins that need to be evaluated are going to be evaluated on the SQL side. And any new data or new rows that populate are going to be added to the table in SQL, in which case, if you're using Power Query just to create a connection to that SQL table, then it's as simple as just refreshing that connection to account for any changes that happened in the database. So just keep that in mind. You won't always need to use these types of tools, but just know that they are accessible when you need them. So those are the only data files that we're going to load up for now. We're going to load some more a little bit later in the course, but this is going to give us a great starting point. So it's a good time to remind you guys to save early and often. In fact, I'd recommend saving as a backup copy so that you have a completely separate backup version. I've been doing that here and there with the file that I'm working with, just because as we get further down the line and we start doing some more complex data modeling and creating measures with DAX, the last thing we want is for our file to crash and not have a version to fall back on. So just helpful tip, save early and often, especially when you're working with Power Query and Power Pivot in Excel.